Hi, Hunter Hastings here. Capitalism has a big problem with bureaucracy. We don't seem to be able to get rid of it. It's the antithesis of entrepreneurial value creation. It slows things down. It limits decisions. It hates creativity. It bogs everybody down in process and compliance and methodology. But what we need is insight and creativity and experimentation to create new ideas, to test those ideas in lots of different ways, and let success emerge because consumers tell us what they want and we figure out how to solve the consumer's problem in new ways we never thought of before. Bureaucracy hates that. Bureaucracy becomes a burden. It slows things down. It decreases productivity. Why do we allow it? Why do we permit it? Why can't we get out of its grip? Well, one of the things we believe in here is understanding theory so that we can analyze practice. And today we have a wonderful theory, or theorist, I should say, of bureaucracy, Ryan Turnipseed. He's a PhD student under one of our great economics professors, Elon, and he's thought about this deeply. He's analyzed it deeply. And he's the one who can explain the theory and also how it relates to practice.
This is the Value Creators Podcast, your source for a new kind of business education, escaping from business administration mode and entering dynamic entrepreneurship mode. We're guided by entrepreneurial economics, which is the source of all growth and positive change for businesses of all sizes in all markets. We talk to experienced experts in value creation, so that there's business learning for you in every episode.
Ryan, welcome to the Value Creators Podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, it's a great pleasure to have you here today, and we're going to talk about a very specific subject, although we may wonder a little bit. But the subject is bureaucracy, which is the enemy of value creation and entrepreneurship and everything that we hold dear about economics. It sucks the life out of novelty and progress, which is what entrepreneurship is all about. It specifies what can't be done. That seems to be its main purpose. It's the opposite of entrepreneurship. And so the question is, how does bureaucracy arise? Why did we fall into bureaucracy, thinking primarily in the business world, but it'll also apply to the government world too? You wrote an article on your Substack under the Old Glory Club banner that you use. And you said there are two underlying theories of bureaucracy. Now, I'm classifying one of them as political and one of them as economic, although that might not be a true distinction. But we'll explore both of those. But you started with a nifty headline about Cracker Barrel's latest rebrand fiasco. So how did you find bureaucracy in that?
Right. So there's a lot to go through with there, but Cracker Barrel was a very big political moment. It was a very sudden explosion, especially on the right wing side of things. And it was basically their branding beforehand had been that they were an old Southern country store. You could go there and eat Southern food and whatnot. So when they rebranded, like most companies are doing now, into just a very bland, two-dimensional, boring sort of corporate style. So the right wing sort of exploded. But something that I found interesting was that they couldn't really explain why this was happening. They knew that there were some common features across Cracker Barrel and other corporations doing something similar. You know, why things are getting more boring. There's a lot of MBAs in high places. A lot of these decisions come from management. So they knew some of the commonalities, the right wing that got mad at this attempted rebrand, but there was no actual explanation for what was happening. So I've really been interested in this concept of bureaucracy for a while, and I've found that there's two very popular but differing theories as to why companies are sort of doing what they're doing now. One of which is Ludwig von Mises's more economic idea of bureaucracy, which I'll get into more in a second here. The other one is, it's probably better to call it a historical analysis, sort of like how Marx's theory is just supposedly derived from history. This one is a historical analysis from James Burnham, which he would call managerialism. Despite the two names being somewhat different, one perhaps being more specific, managerialism, they both talk about roughly the same things, which is as time has gone on, the businesses seem to all be doing roughly the same thing across all the different industries. They follow the same trends. They structure very similarly compared to what may have been possible 120, 130 years ago. Things seem to be getting less centered towards the consumer and more centered around directing the consumer, perhaps pushing a social engineering agenda or whatever else. Both of these two theories, I say, explain this in differing ways. So,
Well, let's start with
yeah.
Burnham. And I would just say, as a note to listeners, that none other than Mark Andreessen has urged us all to read Burnham. He was talking about the Machiavellians more than the managerial society, but for the same reason, which is why these bureaucratic elites emerge and seek control. So dive in, Ryan.
Right. So Burnham's theory is once again historical. It's particular. It takes place in a specific time after specific things have happened. So it's somewhat inflexible in that regard. Burnham says that Western society used to be capitalistic. Burnham, for context, was a former Marxist. So Burnham's understandings of economics is very Marxist influenced. At the time that he was writing the book, he was no longer a Marxist, at least self-proclaimed, but his economics will sound similar. So, according to Burnham, the West was capitalistic in the 19th century, especially, but into the 20th century, differing basically the style or the method of production had changed. So in the 19th century, according to Burnham, everything was about commodity production. Capitalists owned the businesses and made decisions. They had these giant businesses, perhaps, that spanned the world, all aimed at providing the most commodities to the most amount of people for profit. In the 20th century, however, there was a change where production got so complex and technical that more and more managers were needed to coordinate and direct production. And so this is also interesting. Part of that is due to the market, but Burnham does lay a lot of that at the feet of various ideologies, which would encourage this as well. But that sort of feeds into it. I don't want to complicate things too much. So there's a political element here and an economic one, but production is getting so complex and technical that you have to have managers to coordinate it. And what this means is that the industries, the market, and whatever else is being ruled by this new class of managers. And because they are managers, they have their own class interests. Instead of trying to make everything about commodity production for consumers, trying to get profit, managers are very concerned with things like efficiency, coordination, ease of communication, and standardization. So
yeah, let me just jump in a second there, Ryan, and ask you a question. So I've actually studied this a little bit and written about it. I've got a book coming out called The Post-Managerial Era of Capitalism. And the first part of that is studying exactly what you have talked about. And the way I put it was the scale and scope of the entrepreneurs' undertakings just got bigger than they could get their arms around. So they needed to figure out how to do that, how to exercise control. So it's very control orientation. And management is what they came up with. It was an innovation at the time. So that's historical. Is that consistent with Burnham?
Yeah, it's very consistent with Burnham, and it's so once again, Burnham, with his Marxist background, is kind of talking about how capitalism will destroy itself if you want to view it in this way. So, as kind of how you were putting it, the certain businesses just got so big they needed a new specialized role or job so that people could coordinate all of that, so they didn't have to do the whole thing. So we get how modern people think of what a manager is, the sort of historical or personal role. So that fits right in. Burnham would say the managers have a class interest. They're a class of managers. They're exerting influence. So that's
explain what that means, Ryan. I understand he's got this class analysis, but what does it mean to say that the managerial personnel or the managers became a class? What does that mean?
right. So this is This is a little bit difficult because the second theory we're going to talk about is going to poke a lot of holes in this.
Hmm.
So, and I don't fully buy into this, but trying to present it in the strongest way possible. What you have is a bunch of people that fill this economic role that modern industry requires. That makes them distinct from other classes of people like capitalists and entrepreneurs, which own the businesses, laborers that just work the machines, administrators that work for the government. They're a distinct group of people. Burnham would say that as a distinct group of people, they are able to exert influence on the rest of society. And this is also important. This is the second part of it that I mentioned earlier. They are not the only ones that are interested in making things more managerial. Because if you have a group of people that just suddenly appeared, whose whole goal is to make things efficient, coordinated, run things from the top down, there's another organization that's very interested in that, and that's the government.
Hmm.
So it was in the, especially the political systems in the 20th century's interest to promote managerialism. In the United States, we had Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal required a lot of what would look like managerialism. Burnham would call the New Deal and New Dealism a managerial ideology. In the Soviet Union, there was top-down central planning that required managerialism almost necessarily. So that is another managerial ideology that needed a class of managers as administrators that didn't exist before the 20th century. And then you had National Socialism in Central Europe, Germany, fascism in Italy, that was slightly freer than what the Bolsheviks had. But you still have to have this class of coordinators, people that make things more efficient, direct production. So the states all across the world, basically at the same time, had an interest in promoting a class of managers with which they could use that class to influence society. So that it's an
So
indirect way
just
of explaining, but
no. That's very incisive. But I want to understand the the government had an interest in promoting bureaucracy for its own centrally planned undertakings. I can understand that. Did they have an interest in bureaucracy taking hold in private enterprise as well?
so this is perhaps interesting. In the places where there were private enterprises, if you're a government and your whole idea is to administrate or centrally plan the society, we'll leave out the Bolsheviks because they kind of abolished this idea of a private organization. But in the United States and say Central Europe, if you have private organizations, at least in this Burnhamite view, they present a sort of threat to this new managerial order. But this is also important. Part of Burnham's reasoning is that managers were just more efficient. So if I am after profits, first and foremost, if I'm a private company completely disconnected from the state and their programs, it's still better for me to be managerial. And that's sort of what Burnham is talking about. That's just the nature of what people are wanting, how production and businesses are ran. So this is, I think, Burnham's weakest point is just that private industries just magically found managerialism to be more profitable. And they sort of adapted like everyone around them to managerialism. But that's kind of what he would say.
A couple of questions there, Ryan. I think I read in your article that Burnham's managerialism is antithetical to profit. Did I hear you
Yes, yeah,
correctly?
right.
So efficiency has become the way that the traditional bureaucratic business thinks about profit. I'll lower costs. That's efficiency. But how was Burnham's theory antithetical, or Burnham's class, I should say, antithetical to profit?
So this is the interesting thing. If the goal is just to make production more efficient, perhaps at the outset, and I can elaborate on this more here. At the outset, if you want to just coordinate things more efficiently, that's not antithetical to profit. But in Burnham's view, as this class grows, becomes more powerful, sort of exerts its influence on production and makes things more standardized, makes things about the rules that they are making, coordinative, and whatnot else, eventually the goal of the organization of business, say, is just to make things as efficiently as possible, as standardized as possible. And then, as we saw in history, this leads to a lot of cooperation between them and the state. Even nominally, private businesses will do this all the time. So it's not about profit, at least in the Misesian sense, where I obtain profit by providing value to consumers. It's about production, keeping costs down, and meeting what the managers think the goals are.
Yeah.
So
That's a really important distinction. I think one that's a big problem in private enterprise, because a lot of the old traditional firms, traditionally managed firms, have adopted this cost reduction approach to profit as opposed to the value creation approach, which is what we prefer, obviously. One more point I would make, and then we can switch to Mises. You mentioned MBAs in your Cracker Barrel example. And we here tend to take the word administration, and equate that with bureaucracy and think that it has kind of encapsulated all of those bureaucratic commitments to control and efficiency. And that's a bit of a problem. That was business schools. I think the first business school at Wharton was in certainly the early 1900s, maybe even the late 1800s. So was that part of the problem? Did the business schools somehow become the vendors of bureaucracy?
To Burnham, yes, and in fact, the education system, the higher education system, is like the generator for this managerial class in Burnham's view, and is in our case, and this is perhaps the best application of Burnham's idea. The sort of MBA programs across the country where you just teach the same people roughly the same things about business, but at a higher level than the undergraduates, and you turn out this group, this homogenous class of people that just know how to do basic business things. They have basic ideas about business, and management. This is Burnham's perhaps most lasting analysis, is that the education system produces this kind of person, and there's a specific kind of person as well that's drawn into the system. There's a there are a lot of bright people certainly with MBAs, but it's a sort of joke now, especially online from this right wing that exploded at the Cracker Barrel attempted rebrand, that you can find an MBA at the head of all of these very unpopular and completely detached rebrands. And it's because they're just following the formulas that they came up with, perhaps they learned in school or whatever else. They aren't actually thinking about like what is my purpose here? What am I trying to do? So this is the MBA thing is I think the best example perhaps of Burnham's managerialism.
Yeah. And I actually think the problem is worse, because it's not only the actual graduates of the MBA programs, but the concept of the MBA has become the philosophy of business. So even if you didn't get an MBA, that's the way you think, that's the way your firm think, that's the way your board of directors think. We've internalized this philosophy of what I call administration, so bureaucracy in your terms, and it's all pervasive.
Yes, exactly right. There's not much that I can really add to that. It's even if, and this is the interesting thing, like in my hometown, there are self-employed like business founders for local businesses. They didn't really go to college and they just built up this business. They're old now. And if you ask them like how do they do their business, it's perfectly in line with the basic stuff that you get from the business colleges. And like an Austrian analysis, which I'm sure we're about to get into, like it makes no sense. They say that they arrive at their prices by adding a profit margin to their costs, and it's just like why would you come up with this? This doesn't make any sense. I don't care about your costs if I'm buying your product. So yeah, I see that.
Just one last point about that. I think the MBA schools and the business schools, even when they teach entrepreneurship, or they say they do, because they got entrepreneurship courses, it's mostly bureaucracy. It's entrepreneurship as a process, as a series of methods, as tools, and so on like that, as opposed to the value creation that we espouse. So let's make the switch then, Ryan, to the pure economic analysis coming from Ludwig von Mises. Not everybody listening will be familiar with Mises, but summarize the Misesian theory, if I can call it that, of bureaucracy for us.
Right. So to begin with, and this is the biggest difference, and I elaborate on this in the article. Burnham's theory is historical in particular. It exists in a place at a time. Mises's theory, because it's just purely economical, is universal. If certain conditions are met, then this is what will happen. So it's much more applicable, and it doesn't say overpromise or overpredict. So Burnham predicts a lot in his Managerial Revolution book by looking at history. Some things don't quite add up, like they didn't actually come to fruition. Mises's pure economic approach, it is necessarily true if certain things happen. So this is already perhaps an upgrade if you're looking for just
Mhm.
understanding how the world works. Um, to start off with, and this is always good in economics and business matters, it's good to sort of analyze how would things work normally just on a free market. And this isn't like an idealistic point of view or whatever else. It would be nice if we had a free market or whatnot. Um, this is just trying to understand how do things normally work so that when we look at what's going on in the world, we can compare and see what are the changes, what's perhaps going wrong. So on a free market, if I am the entrepreneur, I start a business, I try to produce something that people might want. My main goal is to derive profit, to get profit. How do I do this? I have to provide something of value to consumers such that they value the thing I am producing for them more than the money that they end up giving me. So, and there's no way around that. If I'm on a free market, I can't extort people, force them to do things or whatnot else. Fraud would be, of course, a violation of property rights. So if I'm the entrepreneur, my only recourse is just give the people what they want, produce things that people like at as high a value as possible, and they will give me money, and this will be profitable, hopefully. And so what this means is that entrepreneurs are entirely beholden to the wants of consumers. In older economics, I guess this phrase is not as popular anymore. This is called consumer sovereignty.
Mhm.
As the entrepreneur, I set like the sticker price on the things that I produce. I can say this is worth such and that's the price. But if no one's buying, I have to lower it, or else I'm just holding on to inventory that should be sold off, perhaps at a lower price. So this is the idea. Consumers dictate what the entrepreneurs will produce. Entrepreneurs will try and fail to produce many differing things, but the consumers ultimately choose who is successful by giving them money in exchange for the value that the entrepreneurs created. Now, in the real world, this is not entirely the case. It's not entirely true that consumers dictate fully what the entrepreneurs should do. And that's partly because we have the government or the state intervening to make sure that companies do not suffer if customers do not buy from them. And this is a we can go through examples. An example or two might make this clear.
Yeah,
In the free
go ahead.
market, if I am producing, like, say, food or something for my locality, I'm a restaurant owner, and I produce things that the customers don't want. The customers will not buy from me, and if the customers want a restaurant to go to, they'll go to my competition, give their money to the competition. I will have to adapt or liquidate and do something else. So there's competition for the customers to go to. They choose out of multiple entrepreneurs who is providing the most value, evidenced by the amount of money that they're handing over. Um, so in the real world, though, uh, I may be the only guy in town because of regulations. It's very difficult to open just about any business whatsoever because of
Right.
all the legal paperwork that you have to go through, taxation, and the regulations surrounding that. Employment laws are a big one. So it just stunts me from hiring and firing people, which will become very important later. Um, so if I am the only guy in town and consumers want a restaurant, I can provide less value than I would have had to on the market. The customers are not getting what they want because the competition isn't there. This is one way in which consumer sovereignty is inhibited. And then, sort of as a people might be wondering, but what about a monopolist on the free market or something? And in the absence of all barriers, taxes, and regulations and whatnot else, if there's a monopolist, it's simply because that's just what the people want. If the people wanted a competitor, then someone would start up a competitor. They would go to the competitor, and the monopoly would no longer exist. So this is a this is a problem that's self-solving, say on the free market. So that's one example. The government prohibits competitors through all of the regulations, taxes, laws, and whatever else that people have to be in compliance with. So the consumers don't really get the choice. That's one way that our market is different from a free market. Another one that I mentioned is employment law. So in Mises's idea, in Mises's economic theory, you have the function of entrepreneurship. In an economic analysis, we do not care about the specific individually named person that is the entrepreneur. We care about the entrepreneurial function. And in economics, the entrepreneurial function is the function that bears uncertainty, trying to get a profit by providing value to consumers. That's a very basic description of what the entrepreneurial function is. The entrepreneur, because it has to be a specific person that's an entrepreneur, cannot be in every place at once. The entrepreneurial function is not omnipresent, say. Just because I become an entrepreneur doesn't mean I get to see everything and everyone inside of my company. So the entrepreneur hires a manager who is supposed to basically supervise a specific part of the company that the entrepreneur can't be at a specific time. And the manager is just supposed to act as the entrepreneur would in that part of the company. So it's basically hiring out smaller functions for the entrepreneur, so the entrepreneur can focus on more important tasks. That's what Mises' manager is. Under these definitions, entrepreneurship has always existed in different forms, but it's just always there. We somehow make value through all times and places under uncertainty. Managers have also always been around. So long as a person is trying to produce something under uncertainty, they can't be everywhere at once, they'll hire a manager. This is not a historical artifact, it's just always existed. Under Mises' economic theory, or in a free market rather, if the manager is underperforming, if they aren't making the decisions that the entrepreneur would have made, and this is losing the company profit, the manager just gets fired and replaced. It's a very simple thing that would sort out the system. If you're a bad manager, or if you would be a bad entrepreneur, you get fired by the person above you. Someone else is hired, hopefully they do better, and you repeat this process until that part of the company performs better or it gets cut off. In our current world, you cannot just fire someone with the snap of a finger, nor can you just hire anyone that you want to. There are legal regulations around hiring and firing people that sort of slow down the process. So, beyond just the fact that we do not have a system of perfect entry where anyone can become a competitor in any industry, we also have a system in which entrepreneurs are restricted in who they can hire as their managers and if they can fire them or not. So this gives the managers very relaxed, a very open leeway for doing whatever they want. Under the free market, the manager has to make decisions that maximize profit by providing more value to consumers or keeping costs down. Both of those provide profit. In the current world, where managers have leeway, they don't have to provide profit. They can focus on social causes. They can become social crusaders. So this is the cause of your woke corporations. They aren't bound purely by profit and by what consumers want. They can, if they want to, because managers are hard to hire and fire. There's less competition. The state exists to shield companies from losses and from firing people. The managers can just do whatever they want. They can make the company their social cause, regardless of if it's profitable. So, this is a big issue.
We're delighted to announce the Value Creators online course. For entrepreneurs in every kind of business, big, small, or medium, at every stage, in every industry, our course provides the foundations and principles on which to build success. Simple, clear purpose and principles give rise to creativity, innovation, and competitively superior business action. There are 11 foundational principles or mental models that together cohere into the value business model. Principles for value generation, principles for value operations, principles for value finance and accounting, and principles for value sustainability, as well as the new knowledge accumulation you'll need for continuous innovation. These principles are delivered by top business professors from top business schools: Mark Packard, Per Byland, Gordon Miller, David Rapp, and Bart Vanderhagen. You'll find video lessons from them, along with downloadable tools, processes, and other valuable content. Master these lessons, and you'll master the most important skill in business: value creation. Go to thevaluecreators.com and click the course link.
So I understand that, and you're right, it's a serious problem, but let's get into some other real-world possibilities, I think. The entrepreneurial function, as you call it, can operate at scale, I presume, and tell me if you disagree with this. So yes, it's individuals, but you can have an entrepreneurial function. If you're in NVIDIA and you're working on a project to develop the next GPU, There are hundreds of you working in teams. I think you've got the consumer in mind because you're trying to set up the ability to provide AI or video conferencing like this or whatever it might be to consumers so that they can work more productively and we can all produce more. So those people are acting in an entrepreneurial function. How does bureaucracy come in and destroy that? So, for example, we might say, hey, the HR department is the bureaucracy, or the finance department, or the compliance department. How did bureaucracy start to erode the entrepreneurial function, or perhaps get in the way of it? I understand that you can't hire and fire the managers, and they might go rogue, or woke, but you could theoretically have an entrepreneurial company where everyone's creating value in a value chain. Not everyone's close to the customer, but everyone's helping get there. So how does bureaucracy get in the way of that?
Right. So this is important. The entrepreneurial function is just for economic analysis, and in the Austrian system, at least, the entrepreneur makes the final decisions within the company or within his firm or whatever else. Everyone in the company, for the entrepreneur ideally, should be focused on creating value for the consumer because that's what provides profit. So everyone just does that normally within a firm, and they have specific tasks to do that. So like an engineer providing value for a consumer looks different than, say, a manager trying to coordinate production for the entrepreneur. So the function is just an economic analysis. But with bureaucracy applying to the whole firm, entrepreneur, laborer, engineer, manager, whatever else, what we are doing is instead of having the company or the firm focus on providing value for the consumer for profit, they're instead abiding by arbitrary rules usually instituted by a government. So we can actually just take a hypothetical safety regulation that's been legislated that all companies have to abide by. It could very well be that whatever the company that was doing beforehand that is now in violation of that safety regulation provided more value to consumers. But because you have the state that's legislating these rules and forcing companies to govern by rule instead of by profit, what you have now is that the company tries its best to create value because the company still has to be profitable at some time at the end of the day, otherwise it will just go broke. There's less value being created, and now the company has to schizophrenically adhere itself to rules and to profit production, to making profit by providing value. And you can apply this increasingly. So in our hypothetical example, let's say the government now forces all companies to support some social cause. Just as a hypothetical, I don't think this has actually happened. I think there's usually other forces at play that cause the companies to do this. But now all companies have to support, like, my legislator's favorite social cause, as an example. Well, now my company has to follow that rule, and then if it can, make profit. Because if I don't follow the rule, there's a legal penalty. So what bureaucracy is in Mises' system is governing by or conducting business by rules instead of by profit, trying to pursue profit. So anything in which a firm has to abide by rules instead of abide by what produces the most value for consumers is bureaucratic in nature. Because those really are the two only choices. Either the firm is very flexible and tries to change itself to provide more value to consumers in such and such different ways, or the firm has to abide by rules and then do that.
Yeah.
And if just very really quickly,
Go ahead.
the thing that really causes this in any example is that the firm is not pursuing profit. Profit is demonized. This is what Mises talks about in his book on bureaucracy. Any time in which the company or the firm, the entrepreneur, is not focused on profit first and foremost is when you get bureaucracy. So that's the important part.
Yeah. So one of the things that businesses are trying to examine now is new forms of organization that maybe address some of the things that we're talking about in theory here. So one of the themes is self-organization. So there are no managerial layers. There's no top. There's no CEO making all the final decisions, as you said. There are ways in which they call them autonomous teams figure out how to complete their projects or launch the innovation. And that's a continuing cycle where the teams are creating their own value and they're not dependent on the hierarchy of authority. You can't get rid of all bureaucracy in terms of rules because you say the state imposes some of them, but let's put that aside and just talk about internal rules of running the business. People are trying very hard to do that. One of the measures is the individual job or person adding value? And there are certain ways you can try to measure that. I mean, it might be approximate, but at least it's a good intent. And you try to have every job be a value contributor as opposed to a rule enforcer. So how would that fit in with the theory?
So there's I'll analyze this once again with the hypothetical free market and then the real world because it helps. On the free market, it could work or it could not work. If that form of organization really provides more value, then it will persist. It will keep generating profits. It'll outcompete the other companies, and that's what consumers will choose. So that's sort of just how that would be solved in the free market. Basically, does it actually produce value? Well, the way to measure that is the profitability. In the real world, however, leaving aside, say, state-mandated rules and whatnot, if I am a manager or an entrepreneur, I can't govern by profit internally necessarily because it's hard for me to determine what the consumer specifically found valuable when he gave me his money. So it's hard to measure internal value production, say. So internally, firms usually do govern by dictation or by rules. But the thing that makes it different from just bureaucracy as we've been discussing it is that those internal rules are ultimately trying to produce value for consumers. Whereas in the bureaucratic way, it has no relation whatsoever to value for consumers. It could be, it's hypothetically possible that a bureaucratic rule instated by the state provides more value for consumers. That could be. It could be that the entrepreneurs were wrong and the state was right. It could be the other way around. The economics doesn't necessarily tell us what people will find more valuable, but with bureaucracy, it is necessarily true that the rules that the firms must govern by now are not related to the consumer valuation. Consumer sovereignty is no longer existent on the market whenever it's governed by bureaucracy, but the internal rules for management, ideally, or in the free market, should be towards value creation and profitability. In the real world, because they don't have to always worry about profit with every decision they make, they can make these rules that are bureaucratic in nature and that they're detached from consumers' values and the profit that they could potentially receive. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does very much. One of the ways that businesses tried to think about this is to have internal customers. So if I'm in the accounting department and I'm serving a manager in the manufacturing division, I'm helping with his accounting, the recipient of those services can do the economic calculation, as Mises calls it, and figure out, am I getting more benefit here than my cost? And therefore I've got high satisfaction. And therefore there's value created in that exchange, and that goes on straight through the value chain. So maybe there's some way to think about internal customers and use your same analysis. So
yeah, right. And that's I don't have any specific business application for this because I am unfortunately relegated to the theoretical level currently. But there are different ways to try to use these principles in business. So, like I mentioned, that the one gentleman that owns a business in my hometown, who himself is entrepreneur and manager at the same time. He's the only person in the company. He has to provide value, make the decisions, supervise the entire process that he's doing. Instead of pricing by an arbitrary profit margin that he has determined, and this is what happens in the market anyways, his price will just end up reflecting what the consumers want because they will bid him up or down. So this is, you could even apply this on the individual level, but the point still stands. Now, if the government forced him to do something else by law, he can still try to make a profit while doing his business, but ultimately the consumer can no longer influence him solely. There are these other factors in the terms of government regulation now, which do exist,
right,
because the government's regulated everything, such that the consumers, their valuation is no longer the primary concern.
Yeah, and there's, again, quite an effort going on to think through what you and I call consumer sovereignty, which is not a, as you say, a word that or a term that is easily digested today, but they call it closeness to the customer. There's a famous company in China called Haier that talked about zero distance to the customer. You know, the customer is part of their process. There's all kinds of efforts to understand that value is created in the customer domain and it flows into the company. It's a hard point to get across, but I do honestly believe that a lot of businesses are trying hard to think what that means, what the implications are, and so on. So we might be making some progress. One of the other alternatives, Ryan, is just to get rid of the words manager and management because they're associated with bureaucratic structures. And I've said that that's something we should think about. You know, what are the alternative mental models? So Mises said managers were not necessarily detrimental and were needed by the entrepreneur who can't be everywhere at once, to your point. As I mentioned, I try to think of that not as the single entrepreneur, but the entrepreneurial function operating everywhere and getting rid of managerial bureaucratic terminology. So if we said, hey, there are no managers, like I'll give you an example. There's a company called Morningstar that we've mentioned on this podcast once, twice before, and they don't have managers. They have what they call colleague letters of understanding, CLOUs, which is you and me getting together and agreeing what I want from you and you want from me because we're both trying to create value for the customer. We agree on that. We have a responsibility to maintain our commitment. No one's managing us. There are no rules. We make the rules up ourselves, or the norms maybe is a better word. So there are efforts to go in that direction. Are you encouraged by that?
Yeah, I am encouraged. And this is important because yeah, I do believe that the word manager has been so conflated with what we all immediately think of when we hear manager now. When what Mises is talking about, if you just go strictly by his definition of the manager is just a sort of sub-entrepreneur in a specific place that answers to the entrepreneur, that does not have to look like what the MBA programs and the business colleges have told everyone this is what management is. As long as you in this part of the firm are making decisions on behalf of the entrepreneur that create value, that is management because you're acting on behalf of the entrepreneur. If you're the sole entrepreneur, if you're, say, a sole proprietorship or something similar, and you are just trying to administer your business in such a way that it produces value, you're both manager and entrepreneur in Mises' sense, but nowhere to be seen is what we commonly think of as the manager. Like we aren't bureaucratizing everything or administering everything to death. So this is encouraging. There are different ways to go about management that I hope that creative entrepreneurs can try and implement, just because I personally dislike the current style of management that dominates everywhere. That's why I wrote the article.
It's a problem. So here's another vector, Ryan, that some people are thinking about, and that is adding freedom. That freedom is the antidote to bureaucracy, and it's in a libertarian sense, but it's also in another sense, and that is the sense of some people call it flow. That bureaucracy has lots of barriers, of just time barriers to get decisions approved, and resource allocation barriers, and norms, and those kinds of things. If you think about it as adding degrees of freedom into the company and implement that by removing barriers. If ever I see a barrier to speed or freedom or the free decision making that you're talking about, I try to remove that barrier. I remove that bureaucratic obstacle. And there's a big physics rationale to this about flowing knowledge and energy through any system like a corporation. But there's also a value creation logic to it, that if I take away all the barriers, then all the individuals can work on behalf of the entrepreneur and think about the customer. So what do you think of that as a way to pursue this, adding degrees of freedom and removing anything that's in the barrier as a barrier to freedom?
Right. So just on the abstract level, it could go either way, because even in the most unregulated markets, businesses still have internal rules for reasons. And you could probably think of a few rules that businesses would use internally that probably shouldn't be done away with. Now, with that being said, on the abstract level, in practice in the real world today, there are so many different minute and senseless restrictions on people within a firm that prevent them from doing even the most basic of actions to provide value for consumers, or even just make the firm function better internally. That I would be shocked if removing these restrictions actually resulted in a bad outcome for anyone that was doing it. We're so far in the over bureaucratized direction that I don't think you could remove so many rules that things start to function worse.
Right. And we can't really see inside the companies in Silicon Valley, but there's a lot of indications that they're moving in this direction. So you read about how Elon Musk manages SpaceX and Tesla and so on like that. He doesn't believe in layers of management. In fact, he wants to talk to the engineers himself because they're doing the work and so on. He's a barrier remover. He always is asking, what's getting in the way of more speed? And okay, I'll use the big hammer to get it done because I'm the entrepreneur. He's really the personification of the entrepreneur today. And so again, a lot of these people aren't on MBAs. They're computer engineers. They got an engineering mindset. And maybe they're going to move us in a different direction as they think about how to get things done. I tend to think of it more about effectiveness than efficiency. How do we get these things done at scale, at speed? Now, they do make a profit. If you look at NVIDIA's margins, they're around 75%, which is great. So maybe Silicon Valley's got it figured out.
Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned this because it was, I guess it's 3 years ago now. It was Elon Musk purchasing Twitter and sort of fixing it is what set me on to this subject to begin with. Because that was that was where I presented the variation of this at the Mises Institute, and hopefully soon I will get the paper out on this. But this was absolutely fascinating at the time. Twitter, before Musk purchased it, was entirely overstaffed by people that weren't adding value, and in many cases they were subtracting value for the consumer.
Yep.
It was being poorly ran anyways, even if you were to follow the rules, many of them weren't. So seeing Musk purchase Twitter, fire a bunch of people for not showing up to work, and forcing them to sort of align with what people wanted from the platform, was something that I found interesting because at the time, I had read Burnham's Managerial Revolution. It was in vogue in a lot of different right-wing circles, certainly. And basically everything that Burnham was talking about was being undone by Musk purchasing Twitter, acting as an assertive entrepreneur, firing people that were not producing profit, a bunch of people that would be managerial in Burnham's sense, but not necessarily in Mises' sense. And then actually starting to take less losses as a result of this. So it was that action by Musk that originally sent me down on this subject, and my thinking has developed a little bit since then, but it's still the same. And this is something that I guess we haven't discussed here yet, but it's still important anyways. A lot of the issue of over managing, this sort of managerial phenomenon or this bureaucratic phenomenon, you can see this in a lot of places, is because the entrepreneur is just letting the managers run wild when the entrepreneur is really supposed to be the head of the business. Mises calls the manager a junior partner of the entrepreneur, sort of under the entrepreneur, acting on the behalf of. A lot of entrepreneurs have become very passive. A lot of business owners, so the actual owners themselves, don't really put their foot down when they should. When the managers want to go pursue a social goal, some social crusade, the managers want to add this and that thing to what the product is. They end up failing because of course they will. This doesn't provide value to consumers. The owner should have put their foot down. So when Musk purchased Twitter and did all these internal changes that streamlined the company, made it function better, it was actually an instance of the entrepreneur putting his foot down and forcing the company to act like a company under the head of an entrepreneur instead of a sort of like a centrally planned board under a manager. It was encouraging.
Yeah. Yeah. And you'd have to say then, if that's the case, then there is no entrepreneur at IBM or GE or any of these big companies that they look for persistence and continuity, but not novelty and innovation and growth and speed. So that's a subject for another time. I think we're a little bit out of time now. So
My thesis is that bureaucracy in business is an artifact of the 19th and 20th century, and we can do away with it in the 21st century. So do you concur, or is it inevitable? We just got to curtail it as much as we can.
I certainly hope that we can curtail it.
Well, there's a lot of people who have the same hope, Ryan. Well, thank you. Your analysis is brilliant, and the thesis, you emphasize theory, but I think part of our job is to take what is understood well in theory and apply it in the real world. Even if it's not a one-to-one conversion, we can certainly help people learn and understand and think differently. So I certainly appreciate that. Ryan, thank you very much for today.
Well, thank you very much. It was very enjoyable.
This has been another episode of the Value Creators Podcast. Thanks for listening. You can visit thevaluecreators.com for links and resources related to this episode. Check hunterhastings.com for more content on entrepreneurial business management based on value creation principles.